Hi. In this video, I'll compare the Roland MC101 to the MC707, but also as we go through the differences, I'll give context with other instruments in the category. The category we're talking about can be summed up as standalone hardware groove boxes, meaning machines that let you create multi-track musical platforms with drums, synth, sounds, and even looped clips. Both have the same core sound engine with around 3,600 synth presets and over 600 drum samples with dozens of kits, but the 101 gives you more limited access to changing that sound engine's parameters and creating your own presets. Small note, you don't have to, but this video is best viewed after my review of the 707. There are more sound demos and feature walkthroughs there. In this video, I'll focus on the differences between the two, which features stayed the same in the 101 and which were slimmed down to fit the form factor. Okay, let's start. The most obvious difference is the track count. 4 tracks on the 101 and 8 tracks on the 707. However, while 4 tracks is definitely less than 8 on the 707 and on other groove boxes in the category, when comparing the 101, you should realize that a track here is much more than what you might be used to. Namely, on both of these there are 3 types of tracks. Drum tracks, which each can contain up to 16 different samples, versus other groove boxes that may give you 1 monophonic sample per track. Synth tracks or tone tracks support polyphonic notes, so not just 1 note at a time, but chords, as well as looper tracks that can both playback loops and both pitch shift and time stretch them, as well as live loop and resample internal audio. The fact that a looper track can resample multiple other tracks or basically play any other audio you like means that you can get much more mileage out of a single track on either of these. You'll see the track type, by the way, designated on screen by either T for tone or synth, D for drum kits, and L for looper tracks. Now that said, there are some limitations, right? So on the drum tracks, for example, you have less parameter control on a per pad basis than you do, for example, on the synth tracks. This applies to both, by the way. So to sum up the track issue, while 4 tracks may not seem like a lot, if you're willing to put up with some limitations and trade-offs, you can get quite a bit of mileage out of them. Let's continue looking at the hardware differences beside the number of tracks. Another obvious difference between the two is the sheer number of physical controls on the 707. Oddly enough though, pretty much everything that the extra controls on the 707 can do can be done on the 101, just with one form of shift or button combo or other. Now the 707 does give you more access to synth engine and sound design parameters than the 101, but those additional parameters don't have dedicated controls on the 707 either. They're mostly done through the screen and menu system. Let's take a look at a few examples of how the 101 condenses the 707's controls into its small form factor. So for example, the 707 has 3 parameter control knobs per track, and these knobs can be assigned to any one of several parameters on a per track basis, and can also be automated in the sequencer. The 101 actually lets you assign 4 knob and automation parameters on a per track basis as opposed to 3 parameters on the 707, but on the 101 you only have 1 set of knobs, obviously, compared to the 707's individual sets per track. So let me explain. There are 3 parameters here, right? Filter, mod, and effects, and filter, mod, and effects, plus an additional 4th sound parameter on the 101. Here the 3 knobs represent each of the parameters on a per track basis. Here the 4 knobs represent the 4 tracks, and you change which parameter you control by pressing these buttons. As I mentioned, in both cases, the label of filter, mod, and effects is just a label. You can assign any one of these to any one of a number of parameters. You do it on the 707 with the knob assign button. So for example, I could go track by track and choose to assign the filter on this track to any one of a number of parameters, as you can see here. These change based on the effects that are in the track and the type of track it is. So now this knob no longer controls the filter cutoff, but rather the filter resonance. Same goes here. I just hold this button, turn this knob, and I can assign it to, again, any one of a number of parameters, which change on a per track basis. And let's just find the resonance here. Same deal here for the 4th sound parameter. You just hold it, then choose which destination parameter you want to control with it, say panning, for example. Let's continue down the road of hardware differences. Another material difference is the fact that you've got 2 sets of 16 pads on the 707 versus 1 set on the 101. On the 707, this means each set has its own purpose based on which pad mode you're in, but the general idea is, say for example in a drum kit, you can see exactly which step triggers each of the individual drums, right? So with one press, I can see that, the hi-hats are triggered here, and the kick drum is triggered here. In the case of the 101, since you only have one set of 16 pads, you need to first select the pad you want to control or sequence, then hit the sequence button, and you can see where it triggers in the pattern. Same goes for sequencing notes. So if I choose a note type track, I can choose the step that I want to place notes in, right? And then just punch in the notes that I want to appear in that step. On the 101, again, first select the step that I want to change, right? So let's say this one, and then go to note and punch in the notes that I want to play in that step. Another important difference on the hardware interface side, the pads on the 101 are not velocity sensitive and move physically, right? So there's a little bit of travel here left and right. I don't know if you can see this on camera, but they sort of press in and they're not velocity sensitive. On the 707, the pads have no physical travel and they are velocity sensitive. Now you can, however, set the velocity that a pad plays with by pressing Shift Note. You've got pad velocity control here, and then you can edit that parameter. So if you want to punch in or play live notes at different velocities, you can do that this way. Obviously, another option is to connect an external MIDI controller. Continuing the hardware tour, the screens on these two are obviously different, with the 707 giving you an important overall view of the clip grid and quicker access to more parameters. It's definitely better to have a bigger screen than not. That said, there is a silver lining to the 101's screen. It also has its pros. The actual letters end up being bigger and more legible when you change parameters, and the 101's screen also has better viewing angles compared to the 707. Now, all that said, the 101 does have a few advantages on the hardware side. First, it's cheaper, obviously, and it's smaller and more portable. It can be battery powered or powered with a USB cable and a simple phone power brick via USB. Whereas the 707 needs a power adapter and can't run on batteries at all. Let's take a look at hardware connectivity. The 707 clearly leads in the number of inputs and outputs. Both have 1/4-inch stereo outputs and headphone outputs, 1/4-inch here and 3.5mm here in the front. However, the 707 adds quite a lot more to that, with dedicated analog inputs for sampling both mic and line level sources, including stereo sources, stereo sends and returns, and an additional assignable pair of stereo outputs. That said, both the 707 and the 101 each send each of their tracks out independently as stereo pairs as audio over USB, which is quite rare in the Groovebox world. One little con for both, as far as I could tell, the audio isn't sent as class-compliant audio over USB. I tried connecting them to my iPad and it couldn't detect them as an audio interface. They are, however, plug-and-play on Windows 10. I believe that's because Windows automatically downloads the necessary drivers for them. I did try and install the 101's drivers on my Mac, and due to some inexplicable conflict, maybe it's because it's early days, it wouldn't work for me, but Roland tells me that they've not seen that issue anywhere else. Regardless, a good tip for life is always be backing up your system, especially before installing something new in case something goes wrong, so you can roll things back. Okay, up until now we've been looking at differences, and we'll be looking at more in a bit, but I did want to take a second to look at how the 101 condenses the controls you have access to into such a small interface and gives you access to pretty much the same parameters most of the time. So let's, for example, take a look at track settings. On both, by hitting Shift and the track selector, you get access to a few track parameters, right? So a few general parameters, and then EQ parameters on a per track basis, and MIDI selection parameters. So pretty much the same parameters live here. If I hit Shift and select the track, right, I can see track sound source, which is a cool feature, by the way, that lets you select whether all clips in this track will use the same sound, or if you want to use a different sound on a per clip basis. Now, if we continue to go through the track parameters, you can see that the functions are pretty similar to what we saw before, obviously with some necessary changes, right? So here you only have one MIDI output, so you can't select the second one, obviously, and there aren't any hardware assignable outputs, so that option doesn't exist here, and it does exist here. The same goes for all the effects. So both have 5 main master effects: reverb, delay, compressor, EQ, and a selection of one additional multi-effect. Now, as far as I can tell, both have the exact same effects. You just get a few more buttons for direct control of the reverb and delay on the 707, which you don't on the 101. Let me just give you an example. So if we go to edit the effect parameters, right, go into here and then choose, say, the reverb types. So if we scroll through these, you can see the different reverb types here, right, are exactly the same types of reverb that you get over here. Hit Shift Edit, and we go in here, same exact reverbs. And I went through some of the parameters, they seem similar as well. Same goes for the other things, right? So if we go into the multi-effects and then choose, scroll through the list here, right? Check it out. All these different options up to chorus to flanger are exactly what you get if you edit the multi-effect here, right? And just go through these. Same exact effects. All the way to, here we go, chorus into flanger. Let's keep exploring this. So for example, clip parameters are pretty interesting functionality of both of these, right? If I hit Shift Measure, you get to clip parameters. So there's step length, scale, mode, and shuffle or swing. Step length can be up to 128 steps per clip. And same deal here, Shift Measure. You can see the same exact parameters, obviously more clearly laid out with an individual knob per parameter, but still the same core engine in both. Same goes for step and motion sequencing, right? So if I hit Shift and the pad, you can see the same parameters that you'd see on the bigger brother. So if I hit Shift and the pad here, velocity, start, mute, and ratchets. And there's nice per parameter control here with the 4 knobs. Mute, by the way, is a probability factor, right? So what probability is that this particular step will be muted. So if I hit, if I put it at 80, there's an 80% chance that this step won't play. This actually applies to note tracks as well. So if I go into a note track and then say edit this step, right, you can see all the different notes that are triggered in this step and you can edit them on an individual basis. Same here, I'll select an instrument track. Now check out the screen. As I add notes to this step, they'll be added over here. And just as I would scroll and edit them here, I can scroll and edit them here as well. So in terms of sequencing power, these two are pretty much the same, only you might have a few extra key presses here. Where it does get different is sound design. So both have the same presets, right? So if I hit sound, I can go in and load any preset I wanted into this track. In both, by the way, you can load WAV files and sounds from other projects, but let's go into the presets. Yeah, there's no shortage of categories, banks, or actual presets to go through here. Like I said, about 3,600 in both of them, right? So preset selection is pretty much the same deal here. You just hit this button, then you can choose to load either a WAV file, a file from a project, or a preset, and then you've got, categories, just like over here. Let's go for all by number, and then, yeah, just, I could spend a while going through 3,600 sound presets. But they're all here. Same goes, by the way, for drum kits. There are about 400 or so samples that you have in the database. And of course, you could load your own from the SD card. So while both share the same exact presets and same sampling and synthesis engines, the 707 gives you detailed sound design controls for every part of the synth and sampling engine that's built in here. So on the synth side, this means, all the core elements that you see here, 4 oscillators, envelope controls, LFOs, you name it. And this is just the easy view. There's another view into partials, which lets you have individual controls over LFOs and envelopes on a per oscillator basis for each of the 4 oscillators. This is the synth engine. I wouldn't be surprised if there are over 100 different parameters here. Same goes, by the way, for the drum track engine, right? So if I hit Shift and edit, you can, on a per pad basis, go ahead and edit it and layer up to 4 samples. There's a lot going on here. In addition to 4 sample layers, filter controls, detailed envelope controls for the pitch, for the filter, right? So a ton of depth here, both for the synth and for the drum engines. The 101 synth engine is much more limited. It gives you access to, I think, a couple dozen parameters, maybe a bit more depending on what you're doing. So if I hit Shift and edit, right, you can see that you've got level, pan, sends, filter, controls, basic stuff, vibrato, and a few more controls, right? So, like I said, about maybe a bit more than a couple dozen, but that is pretty much all you get in terms of parameter controls. Same thing on the drum side, right? So if I go ahead and edit this, you can load up different samples on a per pad basis, which is cool, but only one sample, not four. And, I'll go through these briefly. These are the parameters that you can control, right? A bit of EQ and a few more functions here. Now, I totally get the fact that it's much harder to expose this many parameters in a small display like this, and if they did, I'd probably complain that there's too much menu diving. But that said, just like there's an easy or partials option here on the 707's synth engine that narrows down your options, but is much less confusing, it would be nice if they opened up sort of like an extended parameter option or a synth nerd mode on the 101 for those of us that do want to tweak an occasional LFO or waveform now and then. All that said, like I mentioned before, in terms of presets, they're identical, and with 4,000 of them, if you're willing to experiment with a preset, I doubt you'll be limited sonically with the 101 anytime soon. Let's talk about clips and scenes. Here, the 101 and 707 are quite similar in terms of functionality. Both support an Ableton Live style grid of clips, right? So this thing here, all this is available here just in condensed form. So just to explain the basic idea, I can go in and on a per track basis, swap any clip, right? So have track 1 in this case, play this clip, and then track 3, maybe play this one. And activate this one here. And go ahead and activate this one here. And then there's the concept of scenes where you can swap clips for all tracks at one time, right? So I can hit this, go into scene 1, hit this, go into scene 2, scene 3. There are 8 scenes in total. If I hit shift in scene, I can go to scene 5, 6, 7, and 8. So same deal here, right? There are 4 tracks. Each track has 16 clips. So if I go into, say, track 1, these are its clips. I could change to this one if I wanted. Or this one. Or this one. We never stop. Go into track 2, right? Go to this clip. Or this one. And then this supports the concept of scenes too. You just hold the clip button. You've got 8 scenes, just like here. Go to scene 1, right? Scene 2, which changes multiple clips across all 4 tracks potentially. So pros and cons in both cases. Some scenes are a shift function away, right? Here it's all 8, here it's 4, scenes 5 to 8. Now there's actually something slightly more convenient in the 101. It's really nice to be able to just hit a track and see all 16 clips of that track and have them accessible with one tap. You actually don't have that here. So on the 707, you can scroll up and down, to see the bottom 8 or the top 8 clips on a per track basis, which is nice. And if you hit clip pad mode, you can actually see 2 rows of clips, 2 clips on a per track basis. The thing is, if you want to move up and down and get to, again, clips 9 to 16, you either have to do it with the arrows here or with these buttons here. So there are pros and cons to each approach. I like the fact that you can see all 16 clips on a per track basis here. And obviously I like the big grid view here, which gives you an overall bird's eye view of your project. And there is obviously an advantage to having dedicated scene buttons, right? So you can be in note mode and be playing anything you want on the pads and just move scenes in parallel, or doing any other function, muting stuff or using scatter. All that is available while you can simultaneously move from scene to scene. So those are the differences with clips and scenes. Let's take a look at live looping and looper tracks. Now, frankly, there isn't that much to say. They just work the same way exactly on both instruments. The only limitation of the 101, as I mentioned before, is that you can't live loop with a microphone or line input directly because there are no mic or line inputs here, right? You can get audio in through USB, and you can also resample tracks from the internal audio. Just to complete the picture in relation to other groove boxes, the nice thing about looper tracks, aside from live looping, which is easier on the 707, is that looper tracks can also time stretch samples. So if I go into here and create a new looper track, let's take a look at the looper track settings. I hit Shift Record and then go into recording source. So you can take the entire mix of the 101 or tracks on an individual basis or the USB audio coming from a PC. Same as the 707, except of course in the 707, if I hit Shift Input, then the external input becomes an option, in addition, of course, to internal resampling as well. Now, aside from sampling, you can load a WAV file into either one. Let's do it over here, right? So I can load a WAV file from an existing project or just from the SD card. I've got a few loops in here. Let's just take this one. And as I mentioned before, if I change the tempo of the project, right, then the 101 will time stretch the sample, meaning it'll slow it down without changing its pitch, or speed it up without changing its pitch if you like. And you can also change pitch without changing the tempo, right? So let's put this at 140. So you can change pitch without affecting the time sample plays. Right? Now, like the 707, you can actually trim the sample here if you want, right, with sample edit. But yeah, it's you will need to change the start point like this, which isn't that convenient. Just sort of press play and speed it up or shorten it. This isn't that convenient, right? So I recommend, if you want to trim samples, just do it on your computer, then transfer the files either through the SD card or over USB. Let's look at a few more miscellaneous similarities and differences. Both instruments have scatter, which is an additional layer of beat synchronized effects. Now, I demoed this extensively in my 707 clip, so I won't repeat it here, but in both cases you have access to scatter parameters, right? So if you hit Shift and Scatter, there are a bunch of scatter parameters you can edit here, right? To change the character of the scatter. Same goes here, Shift, Scatter, and you can change the scatter effects on a per pad basis. Both of these support quantization, either of notes you play into a pattern or notes that are played out of a clip, meaning that, of course, both support unquantized recording as well. There's no chord mode on the 101, which is a nice feature in the 707, right? So you can program a chord on a per pad basis. Up to you if that's important to you. There also isn't a dedicated mute pad mode on the 101 like there is on the 707, but you can mute, for example, drum pads either on a per clip basis just by holding note and muting them, right? Or on a per track basis. So to summarize, the main differences or pros and cons are: pros for the 707, 8 tracks instead of 4, additional controls, a high-res screen, detailed editing of sound parameters for synth nerds like me versus a more limited subset on the 101, and additional hardware inputs and outputs on the 707. Pros for the 101 are smaller form factor, battery or USB power, extreme portability, and humble desk space requirements, which is important for setups that go beyond one piece of gear. And while it does have substantially more limited sound design parameters both for synth and for drum tracks, for everything else, they're pretty much the same, just with maybe a few more workflow steps here. Obviously, this is much cheaper, right? So what's the conclusion? Personally, while a lot of this channel is about synthesis, it's also about having fun and creating music you like. With 4,000 presets, the 101 may not let you create your own sounds, but it probably will inspire you with what's inside. And given the 16 sounds per pad, plus the ability to load up your own samples both into the looper and into the drum tracks, I think the features, portability, and price of the 101 give the 707 a pretty good run for its money, as well as a few other groove boxes out in the market today. If you want to dive more into synthesis and other electronic music related ideas, check out my ever-expanding book available to people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this video was useful, and don't forget to hit the bell after subscribing if you don't want to miss the next one. Thanks for watching.
We're rolling up. We never stop. We never stop.